Hello, peace be with you. The notion that I want to tackle today is the notion of suffering. Suffering is a very difficult notion with multiple meanings and understandings depending on the spiritualities, the religions, and the philosophies we are referring to. Now, if we come to a normative definition of suffering, in fact, we are dealing with the negative side of life. When something hurts or is painful, we are talking about suffering. So there is a connection here with something which is hurtful. It could be that we are referring to the physical side of the reality, or it could be also that we are talking about psychology and we are talking about different dimensions. And it has to do sometimes with what is understood at what is wrong, what is bad. So there is here a moral connotation when we talk about right and wrong, good and bad. And very often we refer to suffering in moral terms when it comes to this. This is, of course, specifically in the religious traditions and the three monotheisms where these connections are very often made. Now, let us come to very basic understanding and definition before entering into a deeper discussion about the meaning of suffering in our life. So first, what we have is that we have physical suffering, we have mental suffering, and we have also existential suffering when it comes to the meaning of life, when everything seems to collapse, that we don't know what is going on, we don't get the meaning of our life. The perception here is that, yes, we are going through an experience which is this existential suffering, because at the end of the day, we are not at peace with ourselves, we are not at peace with the world, we are not even at peace with God if we believe in God, if we believe that this life has a meaning, we don't know how to get it. So now, having this understanding, there are three main questions that are rising when we talk about suffering. And in a very simple way, we can put this by saying first, what is the source of suffering? So the source, the origin, and then coming to the second question, what is the meaning of suffering? Why are we suffering? How do we understand suffering in our life? And the third question, getting as a consequence of the first two questions, is what place are we giving to suffering in our life? What can we do with suffering when we have no other option but to accept that life has to do with suffering? Now, these three questions are essential for every one of us in our daily life, in the way we are dealing with ourselves, in the way we are dealing with our fellow brothers and sisters in humanity, within our society, with our kids, whatever and however we are living our life, the way we have to deal with suffering will have an impact, a consequence on our daily life. If we come to the very old Buddhist tradition and we try to get a sense of how did they deal with and are still dealing with this fundamental question about the source of suffering and the meaning of suffering, we get to an answer which is essential, that at the end of the day, life per se is suffering. The very moment that I, as a human being, as somebody who get his or her consciousness, the self-consciousness, the starting point of this understanding that I am alive is the starting point of suffering. So life is suffering by the very essence of I being alive and having to deal with myself and then with the world. So, in fact, as much as I have to deal with myself, I have to deal with the world, and I have to go through a process of getting out of this ego, this I that is the center of my suffering. So it's the relation between the two notions that we have in the Buddhist tradition, Atman and Buddha, which is the global being, is the universe, the whole being, and the way we have to deal with it. To the point that in some Buddhist traditions, in order to get rid or to get away or to liberate yourself from your ego and this I where you will find the suffering, you also have to renounce the world. So it's a double renunciation. Is in order to get rid of suffering, you need to deal with your ego, and in order to deal with your ego, you have to get away from the world. And of course, this is not the only answer we have in the Buddhist tradition, because many were discussing the fact by saying, no, you should not get away from the world. By, for example, serving the poor in the world would be a way for you to deal with your own ego, which, by the way, we find this in the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and the Islamic tradition as well, is it's the way you are involved in the world that is important, and not to try to renounce the world. And Albert Schweitzer, when he was talking about the Asian and the Buddhist tradition, he was saying that this was the critical, the nexus of all this philosophical and spiritual consideration and answers. How do we have to deal with the world? Do we have, in order to suffer less, to be less involved, which means to give up with the world, which could be a problem in the way you can understand your involvement with your own life. Having said that, there is something here which it's essential in our understanding of suffering, because it's the essence of life has to do with this. So it's the way we are going to deal with this life, and this with my ego in this life, and my ego being alive, that I have to deal with and try to address the issue of suffering by dealing with my ego and dealing with the world. So there is two steps. There are two steps. The first one has to do with acceptance and renunciation, or renouncement, as it is said in the Buddhist tradition, when it comes to the way we deal with the world. In the monotheistic traditions, it's quite different, because it's not with life as the essence of life, but it has to do with the first fault, the first moral fault. The fall has to do with, in fact, there is a connection between the first moral fault, the fall that we had at the beginning of the creation with Adam in the three monotheistic traditions, and suffering. Suffering started with this because there was no obedience, there was a moral mistake, there was the sense of guilt, that suffering came to be felt by human beings. So the connection between suffering and morality is essential, to the point that very often the first reaction with someone who is believing in one God is, I'm suffering because I made something wrong. It has to do with my sense of guilt. It has to do with my me being guilty of something. Which, by the way, could be right, but also could nurture a sense of, oh, suffering is all about being guilty. It's about the sense of guilt. It's about guiltiness. So we are nurturing this, and we are trapped into a perception of life which has to do with everything comes to a moral translation, and we are imprisoned into the reality of suffering being an answer to something, and not a door towards something else, a way towards something else. Which, once again, it's not, and this is where we have to be cautious, it's not the only position, it's not the only understanding we got in the monotheistic traditions. Many were not only dealing with the sense of guilt, but much more with the sense of responsibility, being in charge, knowing that we have to do something out of it and with it and beyond it. That's essential in our discussion. And there is a philosopher at the center of the Western tradition, but also very knowledgeable about the Eastern tradition, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, who came with a very, very strong position on it. And he had an essential question. Tell me what you do with your suffering, I will tell you who you are. At the end of the day, if suffering for you is just a translation of your guilt and a translation of you being a moral being, and it's all about you being a sinner, you being bad, and then you translate this in I'm suffering because I'm bad, so I'm going to accept the suffering and accept that I am bad, and I end up being passive with it and even not appreciating, not getting what life is providing you with as something which is a gift, because life is a gift. And even in the most powerful moral discourses that we have, life is a gift. So you have to thank God for it. So how are you going to thank God for being alive and at the same time translate everything which is connected to suffering to I'm bad, I'm a sinner, I deserve just to deal with my suffering and not to appreciate what life is bringing me or offering me? So that's an essential question, because he was dealing with the Christian tradition at that time, but in fact he was dealing with all the monotheistic traditions, even though he made and considered that they were not all the same. This was his strong position. And he was saying at the same time, but there is another way to deal with suffering, which is creativity, that out of suffering, you should be able to celebrate life, to make something with your suffering, to transform your suffering, to translate your suffering into something which is, yes, I suffer because I am alive. Life is a gift, and the way I deal with my gift is to be creative, is to be an artist, and then have to do something out of it. So these are two positions and two answers, two reactions to suffering. And in fact, we have to acknowledge something, that the most beautiful songs are coming out, are created, are nurtured by the saddest heart and the saddest period of time in our life. When we are sad, we are much more creative. It's very difficult to write a beautiful song when you are happy. Very often it's our wounds that are helping us to be creative and to translate this into something which is beautiful. In fact, beauty has to do with suffering. In artistic terms, that's essential, because beauty is celebrating life. So how are you going to deal with suffering that you can understand as against celebrating life? Because you deal with it as if it's all about the bad side, the moral side, the dark side of life, and then at the same time you create this beauty that, or you translate this into this beauty which is exactly the opposite, celebrating life. Now, when we deal with this, we have to be very cautious, because it's not black and white. It's not, or it has nothing to do with morality, or it has to do with morality and nothing to do with creativity. It has nothing to do with the meaning of life. It's just the way it is, and our life is absurd, and there is no sense, and end up on the rational side, on the spiritual side, into a black and white position. There is something that is more important, and the starting point is to distinguish between acceptance is not renunciation. Acceptance is not just a sense of guilt that you get and then you are trapped within it. And renunciation couldn't be the answer when it comes to life, but renunciation doesn't mean that the opposite is I go with my life. I don't consider the moral side. I don't consider morality. I don't consider suffering as something which is helping me to be a better human being. There is a notion that we find in psychoanalysis which is interesting, which is a sublimation, which in fact has to do with the artists when they are dealing with their own suffering, their own wounds, their own, mistakes, their own trauma and neurosis, and they are dealing with this by trying to translate this into a poem, into a painting, into music. And this is also something which has to do with creativity and a way for a human being to deal with his or her suffering. Now, the conclusion of that, when we have this picture and you understand the different answers and even the discussion that we had about, okay, suffering is telling us something about the world. Are we fundamentally good or fundamentally bad? So is suffering connected to our natural and essential status? That's a very long discussion, a very old discussion that we have in the West. It was, summarized and epitomized in the discussion of Dostoevsky saying and talking about this young boy of 8 years old, that he is suffering, and how God, who is so good and so full of love, can let an innocent young person suffer in such a way. And we had exactly the same in the French tradition with Camus in his book La Peste, talking about the same situation. But in fact, we find this in Ibn Taymiyyah already talking about this, based on what we got in the Greek tradition. And even in the Confucianist tradition, Confucius was dealing with this 4 centuries before Jesus Christ, and dealing with this when Mencius was talking about the good nature of human being, and a century later Xunzi responding to him, no, human being is bad. So responding to and taking the position of Hobbes in the Western tradition versus the Rousseau tradition in the West, saying the human beings are good by nature. This is connected to the very meaning of nature, because if we are good, what is the meaning of suffering? And if we are bad, we can connect this to morality. So, very old discussion, very trans-cultural, trans-religious discussion, and we have to try to find a way. And as I said, it's not black and white. So the intersection of all these teachings could be that we need to get 5 main teachings here, or at least understandings that could help us to deal with it in a way which is reasonable and at the same time spiritual for those who are spiritually oriented and religiously concerned. The first is just to get a very simple understanding. We are very often dealing with a binary understanding of things. So with misfortune, it's because we are suffering, because we are dealing with misfortune, that we know the meaning of well-being, we know the meaning of happiness. So it's a binary reality. This is the way it is. This is the way we get an understanding of things. We need the opposite to get to understand something. So no happiness without sadness, no fortune without misfortune, no well-being without the opposite, which is what hurts us, what is painful. We have to deal with it. The second teaching here is that suffering helps us to become somebody, to come back to ourselves, to become better, to come back to the essential. So we are dealing with very superficial things. We are dealing with money. We are dealing with anything that is not the essence of our life. And at one point, suffering say, okay, what is essential in your life. We are wasting our time, and suffering say, oh, there is no much time. Life is short, be careful. So we have to come back to the essential. This is the second teaching. The third one has to do with you have to deal with yourself. And there is a moral consideration here that is important, is to go from the sense of guilt to the sense of responsibility, to become responsible, to do something out of your suffering, to become a better human being. So suffering helps a human being to be a better human being. So to get a sense of making suffering a vehicle for us to become a better human being. This is the third teaching. And the fourth one is that with our own suffering, we get a sense of what our fellow human beings are dealing with. And that's also something which we have to consider. It's, suffering, it's a way towards more humanity. It's the way towards more empathy, more solidarity, more understanding. So we need to get this. We need to look at our own suffering as a way to understand others' suffering, our fellow human beings, wherever they are in the world. And this is the way to humanize human beings, because without our own suffering, we could end up being dehumanized. And very often, this is what we see today, unfortunately. And the last teaching has to do with what I said, which is creativity, that our suffering should be considered as a source of creativity, a way for us to write, to paint, to create, to deal with beauty. Make your suffering a way towards beauty, a way towards celebrating life, and the way towards celebrating life, not to worship life, but to beautify life. This is what is important. To beautify, to enhance, to try to change this life into something which is worth living, worth experiencing. Doesn't mean that we are worshipping life, but we are respecting life for what it is, a gift. And this gift, it's coming from God if you believe in God. It's coming from life if you believe in life. At any point, we have to understand that our suffering, it's not a message against life, but a way for us to come to the essential, to celebrate life, to become a better human being, and to be a creative being with our beauty, with us producing beauty in a universe of beauty. May the light be with you. Don't forget to tell the people you love that you love them. Life is fragile.